You still take your shoes off.
Of course.
I want to encourage everyone to make their way back in and find their seats so we can get ready for our first keynote of the Network of Biblical Storytellers Festival Gathering. Tracy had encouraged me to not do a long introduction, which I plan to completely ignore that recommendation. But we are running a little short on time, so she's going to get her way. We could talk about all the various roles that she serves as assistant professor at Wesley, or as a freelance storyteller, or as the dean of the Academy of Biblical Storytelling. We could talk about any of those things. Academy for...
said it wrong.
No.
Storyteller.
Did I say storytellers?
No,
You said of.
Oh, sorry, Academy for Biblical Storytelling. You got that part right. We can talk about all those things, and I kind of snuck them in, right? But I think what we all know and love Tracy for is the way that we've been able to interact with her in this group. It was 1990, she said in her bio, that she first discovered this group, and of course has been an integral part of it ever since. And we see and love about Tracy her love for God, her love for the story of God and his people, and of course her love for those who tell the story of God and his people. And so we are blessed to have her here as our keynote lecturer, talking about patterns, pathways, and play.
You're muted.
Can you hear me now? Okay. This is our reality now, right? Thank goodness we don't have to worry about that, although there always are other technological issues potentially. But it is such an honor, really, for me to be with you in this capacity. I've worn a lot of different hats and continue to wear a lot of hats for this organization. But I'm honored and privileged to be here in this capacity with you this year. This is a special time. It's a special time because it's been 3 years since we've been together. This is a special group of people. Never again will this particular group of people gather in this way. That's something to think about. That's something to ponder. You know, I encourage you to do that these next few days. Cherish the time that you have with the people here, because this is this year's special group. And for those of you who are live streaming from home, we miss you. We wish that you could be here, but we are glad that you have chosen to be safe, if that is the case. And if you are streaming us, you just found us and are streaming us for the first time, you've never heard of the Network of Biblical Storytellers, we look forward to the time when you have been multiple times to a festival gathering. And then in the future, if you happen to be physically absent, we'll have the opportunity to miss you as well. So I am an Enneagram 7, and in addition to being the enthusiast and the adventurer, we're also the generalist. You know, the 7s are the Enneagram's version of squirrel. You know, right? And so I have been thinking about these keynotes for multiple years. I had various files. I'd make a note and put it here. That's the generalist, right? And I'm the one who chose the theme, and you can see it's a pretty general theme. But I chose it because of all that's going on in our world, and all that's going on in our country, all that's going on in our lives. And I don't know about you, but I'm kind of exhausted by all that's going on in the world and in the country and in our lives. And so I was hoping to use these keynotes, these 3 keynotes, as a way, as biblical storytellers in particular, what can our biblical stories and the telling of those stories How can they help us? What might they have to say for us as we try to navigate forward for not just life, growth, and community, but healthy and faithful life, growth, and community. So even though the pathways, patterns, and play are in bigger font here, I'm really more interested in that last part. I'm more interested, and I encourage you to use that last part, the life, growth, and community, as the lens through which you experience everything, not just in the keynotes actually, but everything in the festival gathering. It's just that we'll be doing that through the exploration of patterns, pathway, and play. And actually, all three of those are going to be touched on every day. So it's not that only patterns are today and only pathways are tomorrow and only play is the last day. Definitely the play. We definitely encourage you to play. And thank you, Amelia, for getting us started with some playful songs today in worship. Play has a lot of different meanings, and so part of it is amusing ourselves and being entertained. Part of it is bringing some levity to the heaviness that we have all experienced and continue to experience, as well as playing around with. That's an important word there, right? We're not going to be playing around. We're going to be playing around with various things, and but all of those are going to be going on each day. So let's get started. A couple of years ago, I don't remember. I think it might have been somebody in this group turned me on to this book. So if you are that person, please come up to me afterwards and let me know so that I can personally thank you. This book has changed my life. This is a guy who, I'll show you some of his bona fides here. You don't have to read all of that. Just look at the white. He did all of the research that I have no interest in doing, but all of the research that hard science now has been doing that proves that story isn't just something that we who like to tell stories know is powerful, but we've only had anecdotal evidence for that. There's hard evidence now for this, right? That story, I mean, the science is in, and all the experts agree, stories work. So what I want to do today is to start out by laying a foundation and explore a little bit about what is it about stories that are so powerful, and how stories work in our lives to understand and make sense of the world, and use that then as a foundation to jump into the biblical stories and explore those, and then our lives as people of faith. What might we learn from that? So very quickly, I know it's kind of sleepy time in the afternoon, but just very quickly, some of the highlights, some of the key components that recent neurological research has shown about story. One is that our brains are now hardwired to see the world and understand the world, and to like put the pieces, the raw data that we experience in our lives into a story structure, into a story form. That's been going on for a long time, and to the point where now our brains are literally hardwired to see the world that way. And again, hard science proves this now. And again, if you want to read the book, I highly recommend it. Some really fascinating things in there. Number two, and this should make sense because it's not just with story, it's with everything in life. The more you do it, the more you do it, right? The more you, it's like muscle memory, right? As storytellers, we know about muscle memory. So the more you do something, the easier it is to have an automatic response to it. You don't even have to think. It's automatic. It's unconscious. It could be a knee-jerk reaction, which isn't always good. It can be good if it's a life and death situation, but not necessarily. And we're going to explore the downside of all those things as well. But number three, and the part that's bold there, is basically this dominance of story, over thousands of years of, or hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. Basically, our brain, it's when our brain is in that plasticity stage as a young kid. That's why it works even for adults, because it was like you were hard. It's set basically, in your brain when you were a young kid. We tell stories to children because they're not developed enough to we don't do algebra with stories, algebra with children and infants. We don't start most infants out on Paul, right? We'll get to them on Friday. But the narratives, the stories, because that's what the brain can handle. And because young children are so sort of bombarded with story, that's what forms the brain when it's in that plasticity kind of stage. Then once it hardens, shall we say, as we get older, it's already set. So even though you can be a very sophisticated, analytical, logical thinking, left brain maybe kind of person as an adult, you still don't lose the impact that story made with you as a young child when your brain was more plastic, shall we say. So that's kind of just very, very briefly, kind of why story works and is so powerful for us. And just a couple of patterns, a little bit more foundation here. Some of the patterns of story, and by story we're talking about life experience here, right? It's how we then turn that into a story that makes sense for us. Some of the patterns for that there are three. And we're gonna take a little bit more time now to look at all three of these. But again, I want you to explore these three through the lens of that. What does this mean for our lives, for growth, and for community, right? Especially in these crazy times in which we live. So number one, one of the maps, the story maps that our brains are hardwired for, is that experience builds expectation, right? Something like this. Isn't a fail-safe, right? Because sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. You all know the joke about the pastor, and I'm guessing this is more of a high church pastor, getting up in the pulpit, right, and saying, is this thing on? And the response is, and also with you, right? Experience builds expectation, but in that case, it's not correct, right? The experience that we had, this was not the expectation that we should have had. So a lot of times patterns repeat, and that's great. We can learn a lot. We can understand the world, and we can function in the world, and that can provide a lot of comfort for us, right? If we know what to expect, then life isn't so scary, right? We can. There are things we can rely on, things that we can depend on. But like I said, that's not always the case. And Sesame Street kind of didn't help, even though I think they meant well.
Is not like the others. One of these things doesn't belong. Can you tell which thing is not like the other by the time I finish this song?
Oh, that's the one that's different. Well, really? Because honest to God, when I first looked at this, I picked the flower sort of shaped one, right? Because that one wasn't like as smooth as it. And the one on the right, it's the only one that really looks like a lifesaver, And so, I know that for little kids, maybe it can be helpful to learn about differences. But I'm not so sure in our world today, for adults anyway, that we should be encouraged to be looking at the differences. I think that we're finding a world in which we're not only encouraged to look at differences, but encouraged to use that as weapons to dig in further or deeper on our side. We're going to talk much more about that tomorrow. But this kind of thing did serve us well way back in the day, prehistoric times. If your tribe looked a certain way, acted a certain way, wore their hair a certain way, dressed a certain way, right? And suddenly somebody wanders into your clearing that looked different, right? That might be a life or death situation, right? And so we'd be having that knee-jerk reaction of being able to recognize the difference. That served some of our ancestors, maybe most of our ancestors, well. as far as surviving and then, perpetuating the species, right? But sometimes it's hard to remember that we have evolved past that, the way that we act, but I think that it has largely outlived its usefulness to us now. The problem is that evolutionarily, humans have not, biologically and all, haven't kept up with the evolution of culture and society, right? And so things are changing and at such a rapid pace that we don't feel that comfort and reliability that those expectations that we could rely on before and the comfort that brought us. In many cases, that's just no longer the case. So we're hardwired for this, to look at story and gather the raw data, make a story out of it, experience building expectation. And there are still some things that can be good about that, but hopefully you can see where there are some things that are maybe not so good about that anymore. The second thing, and by the way, I'm going to give you 3, there are more than 3 in the book, but we're just going to concentrate on 3 today as far as the story map. So the first, experience building expectation. And then number 2, the narratives or events, they need to make sense, right? And if they don't make sense, we make them make sense, basically, is the problem. So we're going to explore that. This, for many people, does not make sense. It does not compute. That does not mean that person necessarily is bigoted, prejudiced, unkind, right? It might mean those things, but it doesn't necessarily mean those things. If we can approach these kinds of changes that we're experiencing in our lives with a little grace and say, okay, now that I understand that our brains are hardwired to see the world in stories and stories have to make sense, and can I understand why that might not make sense for some people? Then we might be one step closer to being able to be in healthy life, growth, and community with one another. They, them, for a single physical body does not compute for some people. Does not necessarily mean they're bad people. It's just that, they're an English major, right? And, they or them meant multiple people, right? It's going to take time for some of these evolution of understanding to change at the rapid fire pace that people are experiencing it today. And by the way, I'm really curious to wait just to see if the pronoun debate now might help us figure out how to refer to God in a more inclusive way. So it remains to be seen. It remains to be seen. But we need to be graceful, right? Because our brains are hardwired to make sense, and for many people, that kind of stuff, at this point, doesn't make sense.
Right.
That didn't make sense for a lot of people. This was in the 1967 when, and don't you love that their last name was Loving? Mildred and Richard Loving. They're the ones that took their intermarriage, interracial marriage case all the way to the Supreme Court. They had children. Mixed race children does not compute for many people in the 1960s. For some, it still doesn't compute, sadly. But for many people back then, that didn't compute. And I remember my cousin Marcia, who's 15 years older than I was, so she was like just kind of dating around 1967. And she told me the story about asking our grandma Radosevic. He's like, Grandma, what do you guys? And I think it's probably when this case was happening. What do you think about mixed racial couples? And Grandma thought about it for a minute, and she said, I'm not sure the world is ready for it. And I think she was probably right, but what enables the world to be ready for it? Right? So as is, yeah, she's probably right, but what enables that? So, there was a time when, does not compute for women to be pastors, to be ordained, to be pastors. There was a time in my lifetime where, women on the Supreme Court just did not compute. And now it's even more diverse, right, on the Supreme Court. There was a time where just, let's see, 7 years after 9/11, that the black man, mixed marriage also, right? So there's still some leftover from that, with the name Barack Hussein Obama could be elected president, right? Just 7 years after 9/11. Did not compute for many people, but it computed for enough for him to be made president. There was a time, speaking of a name like Barack Hussein Obama, to have two Muslim women with really foreign-sounding names. So there had been two male Muslims on the in Congress prior to this, but they had converted. So they had, like John Smith kind of names. But these are people who were born Muslim, and have names like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib. Which again, does not compute for many people, right? So the fact that they're women, the fact that they're Muslim, people of color, still does not compute, but it computed for enough that they got elected. This still does not compute for a lot of people. But I think about, again, what's gonna make it compute for people, right? Having exposure to it, right? Because experience builds expectation. You gotta have the experiences, and then slowly, sometimes slower than we would like, that starts to happen. Again, my niece Sophia, when another niece, Gabby, was, we were all in Ohio for Christmas, and they were like 4 and 5 years old, I think, and they were playing house, or they're getting ready to play house. And so one of them said, well, I'm going to be the mommy. Another one said, no, I want to be the mommy. He's like, no, I want to be the mommy. No, I want to be the mommy. And so I'm just sitting there watching this. And so they're kind of, like they were so excited to play house, and now they're having this little argument, and and all of a sudden, like Sophia, and this is one of those you're so smart kind of things as far as I'm concerned, her eyes lit up and she said, well, I know. We could be like Modern Family. We could just have 2 mommies. And Gabby said, okay. And then they all complained about next mommy. Now, I know people, and I've actually had conversations with people who have said to me that they're bothered by how much, homosexuality they see, how on TV. It's kind of like, sort of like, we're not even normal anymore. Right? Because the norm, right? And again, norm not meaning preferred, it's just like bell curve norm, kind of thing. Of course, that's not true. Still very much the norm. But she was, and her complaint was, this friend of mine, she was afraid. She'd started to have grandchildren, and she was afraid if that's all they see on TV, they're going to think that's normal. So, yeah, and the point would be, right? So I understand, again, does not compute. And for some people, it takes them a little longer to come along to get it to compute. But the only way that it's going to compute is that's what gets to the experience building expectation, right? I don't know where I read this recently. It just popped up in my notes, and I thought it was kind of interesting. Was God encouraging diversity in the world by forcing the people, the Tower of Babel, to go out instead of remaining in their one safe space? Maybe something worth considering, right? All right. So we have experience building expectation, and we have narratives or events needing to make sense, and sometimes that's harder than others, but that's how we're hardwired, how our brains are hardwired. So number 3 is not only do they need to make sense, but they need to have meaning. And the experts in this book say that the reason for this is that we ourselves demand meaning in our lives. We want our lives to have meaning, right? And so there's sort of a natural expectation then that anything, an extension of that and what impacts us in the world would need to have meaning as well. So, does this have any meaning for you? Anybody? What's going on here? What do you think? Any ideas? I mean, obviously there's some gaps, but what do you think the meaning is?
They don't appear to be connected.
Is your brain trying to make them connect?
Yes.
Yeah. Right? So maybe So number one, first off, Susan, A+, right? They don't have, these are just 3 random sentences I made up, right? Right. But I looked at it, I thought, well, maybe we think that, okay, so like she's enjoying the breeze, so maybe it's hot. So yeah, okay, well then some of the ice cream truck would only be driving around if it's hot out. It ran out of gas. Maybe it ran out of gas in the middle of an intersection suddenly, and there was an accident, and so the ambulance was coming. You know, okay, that's what's going on here, right? No. 3 random sentences, right? But you see how like it just, but it has to have meaning. It has to make sense, right? We just automatically go there, whether that's where we should go or not. In fact, in this one, this might be worth the price of admission for me here. Because the mind uses these hardwired fixed templates, you know, these story maps, to guide the process of constructing raw input into story form so that we know how to function and understand the world, right? Here's the key. The mind is willing to create any missing bits of key information in the raw data, or the raw input, right? So if there are gaps, our brains just automatically try to fill in those gaps. And sometimes, like with the inductive reasoning, sometimes we're correct. Many times we're not, right? So let's just play. We're going to play a little bit here now, right? Okay, so I wonder what that's going to be. Oh, okay. I think I maybe see where this is going. Okay. I know how to fill in those gaps, right? Because that's what our brain's trying to do. Fill in the gaps, fill in the gaps. You all know how to do it, right? Of course it's a triangle, right? Well, maybe not, right? Oh, wait a minute. Whoa, what's going on here? Okay, that's interesting. Oh, okay, I see it now. You see it? You see it? Yes, right, I knew it. It's a white upside down triangle on top of the first one, right? Except it's not. There is no triangle, there's no upside down white triangle on there, right? It's just 3 circles with exactly the right chip taken out of it and placed in exactly the right place with the other incomplete triangle, right? That it makes it look like that. I mean, like you would put money on. No, that is a triangle on top of it, right? It's not. You see how easy it is? How easy it is to do it? Yeah. Well, maybe this is how those gaps are supposed to be filled in. You can't even see the upside down white triangle now, right? Maybe that's how the gaps are filled in. Oh, wow, we got color now. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. Oh, wow, getting even more interesting. Look at that. Wow, that's really different. Oh my gosh, who would have thought? Never would have done that. Did not see that coming. Did any of you see that coming? Is that what you thought the end design was going to be? Would you have filled in the gaps in that way? Yeah, I wouldn't have. But what if that's the actual design? Right?
We're in trouble.
We're in trouble. We're in trouble, right? Yeah.
What if the mind, this is very interesting, but then the body is not willing?
The mind is willing, but the body is unable.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to be exploring the challenges.
Okay.
The challenges. So hold on to that until day 3. We'll see if we have a better answer for that. All right. So maybe this is the correct design, but we would never have known to go there, right? Because this we were so sure was the upside down white triangle. In fact, even this where we started, can you still see the upside down white triangle?
Yeah.
Right. But that's not what's there. So again, this is worth the price of admission as far as I'm concerned, because this can be again, it can be helpful. It has been helpful in many ways throughout our existence on this earth. But it can also really run us into trouble, right? As hopefully you can see. Because what ends up happening is we start making assumptions, right? And you know what they say, what happens when you assume, right? Yes, right? And we don't want that. We certainly don't want that, right? So this reminds me, or this brings me to Brene Brown. I'm assuming that many of you know Brene. She's a researcher and an author and a speaker, and she has some TED Talks and a lot of books. Many of them are bestsellers. She's a friend of Oprah. Does she need any more bona fides than that? Her education is in social work, and her research is sociology, basically, and psychology. She largely researches shame, vulnerability, empathy, leadership. So all those lovely things. And she has a lot of good things to say. But probably my favorite thing that she has offered in recent years is a thing that she calls the stories we tell ourselves. The stories we tell ourselves. And basically what that is the gaps that we fill in, right? We tell ourselves stories because, again, we're trying to make sense and have meaning, right? So if there are gaps, we fill in the gaps, and that's the story we tell ourselves of whatever it is that's going on. So I remember when I was in high school, there was a guy in my youth group who was hilarious. And he was like a Robin Williams, really, just that very quick, and just, you could hardly get your breath, you were laughing at one thing, then he's off to another thing, and he was hilarious. And I loved having phone conversations with him because it was delightful, it was just very funny. Well, for those of you who don't know me, I laugh kind of loudly. And one day, I was on the phone with Dave, and I do this because that's how the phones were back then, right? And not only that, but they had long cords on them, and they were connected to the wall. And ours was connected to the wall in the kitchen. And I don't remember why I had taken the long cord and went, out the kitchen and was sitting down in the entryway, the back entryway, with my back against the wall, just laughing at all the funny things that Dave was doing. And throughout that conversation, my mom went back and forth, like from the kitchen, and she had to go through where I was sitting, into the family room and back again, And every time she did that, she glared at me. I mean, she was just glaring at me. And I was having too much fun. I'm like, I don't know what your problem is, but I mean, whatever. Like, this is hilarious, right? So this went on for a while, and then finally she came through. And she stopped, because I think she was hoping that her glare would make me stop and say, is something wrong or what's going on or whatever, and I was just like, yeah, whatever. And so she finally stopped and she said, honestly, Tracy, all you ever do is laugh. And she stormed out up the stairs into her bedroom. And I kid you not, I remember thinking, okay, I go to school with kids who are getting drunk, who are having sex, who are getting pregnant, who smoke, who are flunking out. I'm president of the National Honor Society. I'm not doing any of those other things. And your biggest complaint is that I laugh too much? Now, we can laugh about that, but because I saw my good nature and my laughing and my seeing the bright side of life and enjoying the delight of this very funny friend as not only as a positive, but as kind of a core to who I was as a person, the story I told myself was that she's rejecting me as a person, for who I am. We never talked about that, but for years I carried that sense of a rejection of the very core of who I was around with me. And it was only a number of years later, I mean, it's just, family systems. It's crazy how long this took. But I was well into my adult years, definitely into my 30s, maybe early 40s, before I learned, and the rest of my siblings learned, that all those years we were growing up, Mom had suffered from debilitating migraines. For whatever reasons, she had never decided to share that with any of us.
Wow.
Well, thank God I've never had a migraine, but I know enough people who, and I just know I don't like a headache, a general headache, and I know migraines are worse than that. I'm sure she had a migraine that day, and the worst thing that could have happened every time she walked through that, small entryway, was hearing me with my very loud laugh reverberating, between the walls. But the story I told, I didn't know that. If I had known that, I mean, just thinking about it makes me kind of annoyed at how annoying I must have been. Laughing, right? But she chose not to tell the story of the migraines, and I chose to tell myself the story that she had rejected me. Do you see how, and now it's too late. Now she's dead. And so, I learned about the migraines, but I didn't learn about the stories we tell ourselves until after she had already passed. So we didn't have a chance to prepare that riff. So when I say that, the stories that we tell ourselves, and by the way, we do this all the time, multiple times a day. Most of us tell ourselves stories. We make those assumptions, we fill in gaps. Sometimes we're correct, often we're not. And many of those times, not only are we incorrect, but we're like 180-degree wrong, right? But instead of going to the person and saying, you really hurt my feelings, can we talk about this? Or doing what Renee does. I mean, she's trained her family and her coworkers to use this language, to come up and say, okay, this happened earlier, so the story I told myself about that was this. Is this what's going on? And it's a great entry, as long as everybody knows what you're talking about when you say that. So maybe a little re-education is in order for many of us. Again, this is worth the price of admission too. I think this is really, really powerful stuff. I don't know how many of you know Ava DuVernay. Fabulous. She's amazing. She's brilliant. She's a filmmaker. Selma, she directed Selma. Queen Sugar, I know that's a recent thing on TV that she's in charge of. I think her 13th documentary should be required viewing for every American. It's about the 13th Amendment. It's amazing. And so just this idea of the assumptions that we make and kind of never truly knowing somebody's full story. I mean, even your spouse, even your children, even your twin, you don't ever fully, BFFs, like, right? You know a lot of their story, but we never fully know other people's stories fully. So we just
one of the things
hear
that
her
we're
story.
working on really specifically is a project called LEAP that we announced in July, the Law Enforcement Accountability Project. And this really looks at a new way of analyzing systems. And this system that we're analyzing is not just the policing itself, but the way that citizens interpret policing.
Since a little scroll growing up in Compton, a heavy police presence there. Not feeling safety when I would see police, feeling fear, feeling like they were coming after me or coming after the people.
So you growing up, police represented danger, fear.
Danger, yeah.
Watch
Which is
out.
the same way to grow up.
Yeah.
Many people think safety, they think relief, they think the good guy.
He's my friend.
He's my friend.
I'm in danger. This is where I'm going to go to.
Never felt that.
Never felt that.
Never felt that.
The narratives and myths that we have bought into as it relates to policing. The idea that we don't have to know who the offending officer is. We don't have to know where he goes. We don't have to even know his name. Leave that to us, and you all mourn the victim. This idea says, no, we get to know it all. We pay you. You work for us. And so if something has gone wrong, if there's been abuse, if there's been murder, that we need to start to retrain ourselves into what we can ask and what we can know. So Lee uses art to use that to create new narratives around these police interactions. And we really focus on telling the side of the story that is usually hidden from us, which is what happened to the officer? Where did he go? Where did she go? Why did that happen? Were they prosecuted? Why weren't they prosecuted?
Yeah, that's a whole deep topic there. But this idea of even just the little interview she had with Oprah, how many of you, growing up or now, like, you think, the police, they're my friends, they make me feel safe, did it ever occur to you that might not be the experience for other people, right? The whole walking in each other's shoes, all of those kinds of things play in here. But we're not going to know other people's stories, and we're going to tell ourselves stories, fill in the gaps, maybe not always accurately, if we don't take the time to sit down and try to get to know people and ask them those questions. That it behooves us. It always would behoove us, but especially now. Which brings us to the Bible. I promised we would get there eventually, right? Some people think of the Bible as, anybody ever heard this? Right? The best instructions before leaving Earth, right? And I say, really, the best, and the only reason I'm skeptical is there are a lot of gaps. There are a lot of gaps. I mean, it's maybe some good instructions, and I would say, why do we have to wait till we leave Earth? Let's use it to figure out how to live while we're here, right? But there are a lot of gaps, and how often are we filling in the gaps in ways that maybe aren't, making assumptions that maybe aren't quite as accurate or as faithful as they could or should be. So we've got patterns. Our brain, understands the world and storied patterns, that sort of thing, and those can be good. Some of those patterns, though, need to be re-examined, maybe broken, right? Cliff, I'm going to invite you up. He's going to tell us a story. We heard wonderfully, thank you, Cindy Chapter, for the wonderful rendition of today's theme story. I've asked Cliff, who is one of my ABS students. By the way, you are going to hear all 8 of my ABS students as part of my keynotes. So instead of doing the epic, this is the requirement at the Festival Gathering. And so we had a great Zoom session and kind of brainstormed, different ways that they could be utilized. And I brought some ideas, they brought some ideas. And so this is one of my ideas. I wanted us to look at the anointing of David as a pattern being turned on its ear. Right? And so we need to hear how the pattern was first established to know how it wasn't then followed when it came time to anoint David. So I've asked Cliff to share with us the first time that Israel had a king, right? After all those years of judges, right? And he's going to tell us the anointing of Saul.
There was a wealthy man from the tribe of Benjamin named Kish. And he was the son of Abiel, the son of Zerah, the son of Bechorath, the son of Aphiah, which means I make breath. He was a Benjamite. And he had a son named Saul, who was a handsome young man. I mean, no one in Israel was more handsome than Saul. And he stood head and shoulders above everyone else. Now, when the donkeys belonging to Saul's father Kish were lost, well, then Kish said to his son, Saul, take one of the servant boys and go. Look for the donkeys. And so they traveled through the highlands of Ephraim and the land of Shalishah, but they didn't find anything. They traveled to the land of Sha'alim, but still found nothing. And so they circled back to the land of Benjamin. But they still didn't find the donkeys. And Saul said to the boy who was with him, let's go back before my father stops worrying about the donkeys and starts worrying about us. But the boy who was with him said, no, listen. There is a man of God in this town. He's famous. What he says, everything he says, actually happens. So let's go there, and then maybe he'll be able to tell us where we should go. Saul said to him, great idea. Let's go. And so Saul and the boy went up to the town where the man of God lived. And as they entered the town, suddenly Samuel, the man of God, appeared coming toward them on his way up to the shrine. And Saul approached Samuel in the city gate and asked, please tell me, sir, where the seer's house is. Samuel said, I'm the seer, but go on ahead of me to the shrine, and you can eat with me today. And then in the morning, I'll send you on your way, and I'll tell you everything you want to know. As for the donkeys that you lost 3 days ago, they've been found. Don't be worried about them. So Samuel took Saul and his young servant and brought them to the banquet room. And Saul ate with Samuel that day. And when they came down from the shrine to the town, a bed was prepared for Saul on the roof, and he slept. Near dawn, Samuel called to Saul on the roof, "Wake up! I send you on your way." And so Saul got up, and the two of them, he and Samuel, went outside. Now, Samuel, he took a small jar of oil and poured it over Saul's head. And he kissed him. And Samuel said, "The Lord hereby anoints you leader of his people Israel. You will rule over his people and save them from the power of the enemies who surround them. And this will be the sign for you, that you have been anointed by the Lord as leader of his very own possession. First, when you leave me here, you will meet two men near Rachel's tomb on the border of Benjamin at Zelzah. They will say to you these precise words. The donkeys you went looking for have been found. And now your father has stopped worrying about the donkeys and is worried about you. And he's asking, what shall I do about my son? Second, when you go on a bit further, you will come to the oak at Tabor. 3 men who are going to consult God at Bethel will meet up with you there. 1 will be carrying 3 young goats. 1 will be carrying 3 loaves of bread. And 1 will be carrying a jar of wine. They will ask you how you are doing, and they will offer you sacrificial bread, which you should accept. Third, when you go on from there, you will come to Gilbeath Elohim, which is a Philistine fort. And when you enter that town, you will encounter a group of prophets coming down from the shrine, preceded by harps and tambourines and flutes and lyres, and they will be caught up in a prophetic frenzy. And then the Lord's Spirit will come over you. And you will be caught up in a prophetic frenzy right along with them. It will be like you become a completely different person. Now, once these things have happened, do whatever you would like to do, because God is with you. Never mind. Then go down to Gilgal ahead of me, and I will meet up with you there. And I will offer entirely burnt offerings and make well-being sacrifices. Wait 7 days until I get to you, and then I will tell you what you should do next. And just as Saul turned to leave Samuel's side, God gave him a different heart. And all these things happened that very same day.
Thank you, Cliff. It's kind of a beautiful story, right? To remember, experience builds expectation. Well, we haven't had an experience yet. This is the first time that Israel now, after asking, finally says, okay, I'm not really happy about it, but I'm going to give you a king, right? And you know, just the anointing and the breaking bread together and the kiss and, you know, I mean, just kind of and the Lord with him and changed his heart, and, you know, just kind of a beautiful story. There are the 3 things. So the question, you know, this is the lens, right? You know, what potential patterns then do we maybe see that are being established for Israel now? You know, because as an Israelite, you know, we gotta kind of know going forward what to expect, right? How to make meaning of it, or how to understand it. So we've got Saul's anointing. We've got some clear things, and we've also got some gaps, right? So we're going to explore this. So let's fill in the gaps with the 3 very clear things that Cliff showed us, right? And I love how they encompass all of the senses, right? So if you're a sensor, you know, Myers-Briggs S, right? This is a great way to get signs that, you know, this is really of God, right? So the first thing you're gonna, people are gonna talk to, they're gonna tell you something, right? So you're gonna hear them, right? And see them, I guess, too, right? Then you've got these 3 people coming with the 3 goats and the 3 loaves of bread. Why is it only 1 jug of wine? No, I mean, why can't it be 3? But anyway, so you've got, you're seeing, you're smelling, and tasting, right? All of that. And then the last one, amazing, right? This frenzy where his whole body gets caught up in it, right? And moving around and dancing. It's a full body experience, which just sounds amazing. And they all happen that day. I mean, that's the crazy thing. Doesn't have to wait for it, right? I mean, they all happen that day. So it's very clear. So that seems to me like, okay, we're setting, it's really clear now, kind of what to expect in the future, right? I mean, you can see why you might expect that, right? But that's not quite what happens. I was intrigued by the line that says, do whatever, what is it?
Once these things have happened, do whatever you would like to do.
Yeah. Do whatever you would like to do because God is with you. Awesome! Right? Well, poor old Saul, I'm going to tell you something. Like, spending time with this story, this extended story, I started to feel sorry for Saul, right? He does 2 main things before David is then chosen, right? And Saul is rejected, like we heard in the other story today. And we get the beginning of it at the end of Cliff's story, right? Samuel clearly says, go on to Gilgal, wait 7 days, and then I'll be the one to offer the offerings and the burnt sacrifices. Now it's kind of crazy in 1 Samuel. Again, it's the Bible, lots of gaps here, right? So different sources, so if you read it chronologically, it doesn't really make sense, right? Because a lot more happens that could happen in 7 days, right? So like all this stuff happens, he goes to battle, all this, and then we come back and it's like, oh, now 7 days later, right? He's waiting, and his troops are starting to desert, right? Because the Philistines have been very powerful against them in previous battles. And so he's like, okay, I know I'm supposed to wait. Samuel's the one who's supposed to do this. And he's like, okay. And the reason they're doing the offering is to get God's blessing before going into battle, right? So his whole reason for them just saying, I don't know where Saul is, or Samuel is. I'm going to go ahead and do it. And no sooner does he get done doing it, guess who shows up? Right? And Samuel is ticked, right? And God supposedly is ticked, right? And just like, okay, I mean, come on. It just seems a little, like a setup, almost, right? So that's the first uh-oh, right? And the second is when God, this is a little bit later, right? And again, if we're reading this as is, God's saying, back when I brought you out of Egypt, the Amalekites? Yes, the Amalekites. They weren't too nice to the Israelites. So I want you to go in there and just slaughter them all. All. Women, children, animals. Don't keep anything. Just like destroy everything. Thus says the Lord. Yeah. And Saul almost does that. He does a pretty good job of slaughtering everything. But he keeps the king alive. And he keeps some of the best booty. And by booty, I don't mean booty. I mean, right? Why? To give it to God, right? He's going to get. It's not like, oh, I'm gonna, add it to my coffers. It's for God. No, big no, right? So what's this? Do whatever you want. God's with you. God, right? Well, he disobeyed God. Okay, but the next guy, he did some disobeying too, right? God just comes across as kind of fickle here in a lot of ways. And, am I okay with that? I don't know. That's something that on my ongoing spiritual journey that I have to, that I often struggle with. It just, it kind of reminds me, that maybe Saul felt when all this was happening, he was like, wait a minute, you said I could do whatever I wanted. It might have felt a little bit like this. Sure, we didn't hear that one. Did you hear it? Okay. Didn't seem very loud. Okay. That's one of my favorite scenes from Poltergeist, I think. So let's go look at David's anointing now. And those three, what seem very clear signs, 1, 2, 3 for Saul. Nope, none of those are there for David. Okay, it doesn't have to be exactly the same, right? But there weren't even really any real signs with David, right? Except maybe, interestingly, this was his anointing was done in the presence of his brothers. Maybe that's a sign. I'll come back to that in a little bit, where Saul's was maybe a little more private, so I don't know if that's a sign or not. But let's go back to Paul. So we have the three things, but that doesn't mesh with David's anointing. So what else can we see from Paul's or Saul's? The anointing was done by Samuel. Okay, that's with both of them, right? The anointing was unexpected. Total surprise. Saul did not see that coming. David didn't see it coming. And Saul is anointed from the youngest tribe, the Benjamin tribe. Okay, that's sort of a connection with David being the youngest. So, okay, so those things are maybe that's a pattern, maybe that's being established, but there's still a lot of gaps there, right? One of the things that I found interesting is that people look, what does this ruddy mean? David being ruddy. Of course, a lot of thoughts on that. One of them that I read was that, and sometimes when I tell this story, I do it where I say, finally David comes in from the field. Now this one, looking at the other brothers, that David, other brother, well, this one was ruddy, because what one school of thought is that he was redheaded. He was the only redheaded one, so his brothers thought, brother from a different mother, brother from a different father. No. Yes, father. Yes, and that they wanted to kill David and their mother for playing around, or not playing around with, playing around. And Jesse saved him, but sort of punished him by saying, okay, we're going to send you out in the fields. You're going to keep the sheep, which was, some think maybe is a lower, status job. That's kind of interesting. Right? And again, does that flip our expectations of who the king would be? Only the second king in Israel's history? That's kind of interesting to think about. The beautiful eyes. There are some that say that he was young enough that it just meant like they weren't, kind of not formed in it like he couldn't see, but he was still young and impressionable. Like he wasn't quite wise yet. I have a different take. I told this story because I worked with all three of these stories this last year, and I told this story to a friend of mine to say, hey, what did you notice? What do you think? And she said, oh, the beautiful eyes. Like, to me, that just meant, the eyes are the window to the soul or the heart, right? And so maybe there was something about David's eyes that people could kind of just see right into his soul or right into his heart with, which kind of, okay, God, because we heard, right, God doesn't look on outer appearances, God looks at the heart. Well, that's kind of an interesting way of looking at that. But the other thing I wanted to share with you that would have required Cliff to do even more, a longer story, so I didn't have him do this, is to go all the way back to the end of chapter 3 to get more Samuel's story. Because this and Amelia, that was wonderful. God just being so exasperated. Why are you still grieving over Saul? Right? I've rejected him. Well, we're told at the end of chapter 3 in 1 Samuel that Samuel grew up, because we know the story about Hannah and him taking as a little boy and all that, right? So Samuel grew up. The Lord was with him, not allowing any of his words to fail. All of Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, they knew that Samuel was trustworthy as the Lord's prophet. So whatever he said, right, not only was it true, not only was it of God, right, he kind of has a reputation to uphold, right? So if he's the one who's saying, no, he is your king. In fact, and again, I wanted to be kind to Cliff and, not make him learn 3 chapters. But he's actually anointed 3 different times, or he's like appointed, anointed, kind of like there's 3 different occasions when all this is going on. And it starts out privately, but then, it's in front of more people and more people. So like everybody knows this now. And everybody in Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, we can trust the word of Samuel. So if all of a sudden this isn't our king, then what does that mean about the word of Samuel, right? And what does that mean about the word of God? Because that's what Samuel's speaking. Ooh, all kind of icky places, or challenging, shall we say, places there. But that could be partly why he's grieving, right? And grief is layers of a lot of different emotions. So there could be a lot going on there. But anyway, so we have this pattern we're trying to figure out. We've got 2 examples, a couple of sort of similar things, but not much, right? And we can be so tempted to fill in the gaps and try to make sense of it, right? Try to square the circle so that, God isn't fickle, for instance, right? But what if God is, right? What if that's who God is? Are we open to that kind of messiness? What if that's what God looks like? Right? I don't mean literally looks like, but what if that's the, right? Oh, maybe. Who knows, right? I mean, do patterns have to be predictable? Do they have to be reliable? Do they have to be set in stone? No, I think, we could all point to multiple examples in our lives where that's not the case. In fact, I would say, and I say this to my students, right, in performance techniques and things to work on, variety is the spice of life, right? But that's not always easy for brains that are hardwired with neural templates and, story map structures, right? We got to make meaning out of that raw input. So that's our challenge, is to figure out, how do we hold those 2 things in tension? So I encourage you to maybe be open to some ambiguity, to some messiness. And Jeremiah, I'm going to call you forward. One of the things that my ABS students suggested when we had our Zoom brainstorm was that a similarity that they saw in the 3 stories was some lamenting, some fear and grief and lamenting. And so they thought that maybe Psalm 51 might be kind of fun to experience all 3 days paired with each of the 3 days' theme stories. So you're going to hear Psalm 51 each day. But again, I encourage you to experience it or hear it through the lens of that day's theme story in particular, because each of the tellers are very different and they're going to tell it in a different way. So what might, interestingly, we believe David, as the author of this psalm, what might be the connection, or what might we have to learn for life, growth, and community about David's story through this particular psalm of his.
Cleanse me with hyssop, and I will be clean. Wash me, and I'll be whiter than snow. Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones you've crushed rejoice. Hide your face from my sins and blot out all my iniquity. Create in me, O God, a clean heart, and renew a steadfast spirit in me. Do not cast me away from your presence or take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and grant to me a willing spirit to sustain me. Then I will teach transgressors your ways, and sinners will turn back to you. Deliver me from the guilt of bloodshed, O God, the God who saves me. In my tongue will sing of your righteousness. O God, open my lips, and my mouth will praise you.
Thank you, Jeremiah.
That's why God stayed with David. Maybe.
Maybe that's why God stayed with David.
Yeah.
Yeah, it could be. It could be. I mean, David's a complicated character.
Yeah.
Saul's a complicated character. Samuel's a complicated character. God's a complicated character. We're complicated characters, right? And that is something, that I have found. It's like, well, if God could figure out a way to use this person, maybe there's hope for me, kind of thing, right? So getting back to patterns, right? As I mentioned, as an Enneagram 7, the generalist, so there are a lot of, and as an educator at heart, actually, maybe it's more that in this case. I do like to offer a variety of ways to process information. And so if you haven't noticed yet, or if you haven't been yet to the Nook, one of the round tables in there, on them I have put 4 spirographs. I mean, how many of you played spirographs when you're... So we're going to play with patterns, right? Or I invite you to do that in your spare time if you're so inclined. And I don't know if you remember, I'm assuming you know the basics of the spirograph. But several years ago, I did a little experiment, and what I did is, you've got the ring, right, and that's the base, and then these different sized spheres that you put either on the inside or the outside. And each of those spheres has a bunch of circles around it. See the spiral of circles there that go around? Of course, the bigger ones have more circles, the smaller ones have smaller ones. But as you can see, the bigger one is the most cramped inside, right? There's not a lot of space there. The smallest one has a lot of space, and then of course the middle one has a medium amount of space on the inside in particular. But what I did with my little experiment a couple years ago is that for all 3 of those, I put the first hole of the spiral facing down, right? So it's lined up. It's lined up with this hole right here, right? So you can see, okay? And so what I did is I ran it 3 times on the inside and 3 times on the outside for each of the 3 sized spheres, all right? And what I did is the first time I would put one color, I think green, pink, and purple were the 3 colors. So I don't remember what order I did it in, but let's just say for the pink one, I started with hole number 1 of the spiral and went around. And then got my green one and I went about halfway, however many holes there were, I went to the middle, did it with that color that time, and then took my 3rd color pen and went all the way around to the inside of the spiral and did that. And I did that for the inside and the outside for all 3 of them. And what ended up happening, and again, as I said, the biggest sphere was the most cramped. So that was the design, that was the pattern that came out, right? So it's very cramped in the middle, so you can see there's not a whole lot in the middle there, right? So that was the design from the sphere being in the middle. This out here is the design of the sphere being outside the ring, right? Okay, that's kind of interesting. I mean, there's not a lot there. It's kind of, right? But, okay, that's all right. For the smallest one, of course, there's the most room inside. Exact same thing, right? But a very different sort of design or pattern, shall we say. And then for the medium-sized one, right? So, remember, that's the first one. It was the biggest. Second one, smallest. 3rd one, the medium, right? Doing the exact same thing every time, right? Just with a different sized sphere. Now, I don't know about you, but for my money, that was definitely the most interesting, right? And I just got to wonder, I was like, is there a metaphor for life here about, kind of finding the happy medium? Again, not to say that there are times in life when we need to push beyond just a happy medium, But in a world where even a hint of somebody being like, you know, a little bit outside of, you know, means I'm going to dig my heels in, right? Even more. So again, there's a time and a place for everything. But I just invite you to to spend some time, and I encourage you to do more than one design, right, or one pattern. Try to play around with it. Just see how changing one minute thing can sometimes really largely change the look of the pattern. And just as you do it kind of like the labyrinth. You know, do it in in meditative states, do it in a state of prayer. Maybe take an issue to God as you're doing it. It's just sort of a different version of the labyrinth. And just see if you come up with any insights as to how we might better live healthy and faithful lives, and have growth and community. So speaking of that, Phil, you're standing up there. Do you have nice, neat handwriting? No. Okay. Who has nice, neat handwriting?
My wife does.
Oh, Lori, great. Okay. So we've got our patterns up here. I can't remember if I told you I was going to be testing you. Did I tell you that? Yeah, because I'm an educator at heart, right? So we kind of set out at the beginning, making it clear that I asked you to use the lens of the what came after the colon, right? So patterns, pathways, and play, yeah, that's important. But what I'm really interested in is what comes after the colon, right? The life, growth, and community. So I know that you might need to sleep on this, and more will come of it. But Lori, I'm going to ask you, or we're going to ask the crowd, just like any insights you've gotten specifically for how to better live in this world, or how to maybe achieve healthier or more faithful life, growth, and community. And I'm going to ask Lori to write those up here on the board. Any ideas?
Don't be so quick to fill in the gaps. Find out a little bit more. Why are they where they are?
Okay, so don't be so quick to fill in the gaps.
Flexible.
Hold on. Find out where they are. And what was the third thing you said?
Well, that was it. Don't be so quick to fill in the gaps and find out where they are. What's their story?
What's their story? Yeah, okay.
Flexibility.
Flexibility.
Involved that plastic stuff going on.
Yeah, we do have one. Is Artemis in here? She's outside. Okay. You're gonna see Artemis tomorrow during the AVS graduation. She's still on the stage of plasticity, right? Some of us, I'm not sure how plastic our brains are anymore. But anyway, other ideas.
Get involved for the change.
Get involved for the change. Yep. And we're gonna hear from Ava tomorrow again. She's gonna say a little bit more about that as well. Get involved for the change. Yes.
I'm thinking of communication, and if you're brave enough to tell your own story, it helps other people understand their story.
If you're brave enough to tell your own story. I'm sorry.
I was thinking in terms of you and your mother, and probably all of us. If we knew other people's stories better, if they communicated their stories, it helps us understand our own stories.
Yeah, hearing other people's stories can help us understand our own stories, right? But why don't we tell our stories, or right? And there are a lot of good reasons that we might not tell our stories, right? We tried it, we got shot down, we get made fun of, whatever. So there needs to be a safe, a place, because it's very, you make yourself very vulnerable when you tell, especially personal stories. Right? So you need to make sure that they know that's a safe place to do that. Yes?
If the story doesn't make sense, try more exposure rather than more judgment.
Yeah. If the story doesn't make sense, try more exposure rather than more judgment.
Amen.
Yes.
Yeah.
Excellent. And Lori, if you need to go on to the next page, obviously you can do that. Jim? Yeah?
Don't assume that something like the story of Mr. and Mrs. Loving is necessarily handled for forever.
Mm-hmm.
That you need to remember, you know? The whole
Absolutely.
generation of LGBTQ people that don't remember the AIDS crisis.
Right.
And now we have monkeypox.
Right.
And we're slow to react to it.
Yep.
And they don't know how slow we react to AIDS.
Yes.
And yeah, so to remember the old patterns and remember that there was a time when they weren't approved of either.
Well, I would add to that, Jim, that as we know, as storytellers, right, one of the things that I love best, and I refer to it as story capital S, right, is the fluidity, you know, of story, right, and how, even though we might have a story like, you know, beginning, middle, end, the end, right, most stories in life continue, right? Especially if they're about people and issues of people. And so, and you're exactly right. So many of us, we feel like, oh my gosh, there's just so much. But okay, well that was solved. Phew, don't have to worry about that anymore. You know, and think, well, you know, is that true, or is this an ongoing story that does continue to need our attention, our work, our energy, our advocacy. We're going to talk a little bit more about that tomorrow as well, so thank you. Yep.
Reflection. I think you have to reflect back on what you've done and what you want to become, because sometimes you find that as you reflect, you have bad patterns, or you have unhealthy patterns, and so you want to change those behaviors. So I think it's important to take some time to reflect.
Reflection is just good in general with pretty much everything in life, isn't it? And don't hear me say that all patterns need to be broken. I mean, I'm sure we have some people who are very disciplined about getting up every morning and exercising and, you know, right? God love you. I mean, that's a pattern I've never been able to establish. But you know, that's a great one, right? So that's a good pattern. So there are good patterns still, but you know, and I have a cousin, the one I told you about who asked grandma about mixed race couples, who every January 1st, she sits down and just does a year in review, you know, just looks back at her last year and kind of takes stock. And again, something that might have worked really well for her for a time or a long time, but maybe isn't quite so much anymore, you know. So it's, and being open to saying, yeah, that was what it was for that time, but it's okay to let that go because it's not as helpful, or this would be more helpful now. Yeah. Yes?
Take a look at the stories we tell ourselves.
Take a look at the stories we tell ourselves. Yes, right. Because I'm telling you, y'all, we do it every day, every single day, multiple times a day usually, right? And yeah, one more, and then we have a final story to share with you. So yeah, Sandhya.
Even though your patterns are distorted, have the courage to live that story.
Even though the patterns are distorted, have the courage to live the story.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. All right, well, we're going to probably put this up in the nook, or maybe in here. Just look for them. And I invite you, as you continue to mull this over and to consider it, to add more thoughts on there. And I encourage you then to continue to, the rest of us, to a couple times a day, maybe go by and read what people have put up there as a way to leave this place in a few days, maybe equipped a little better for that life. I almost say life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Life, growth, and good one. Debbie, I'm going to ask you to come forward. We're going to close out our time today with a story that is going to help us transition into tomorrow. So tomorrow, again, we're doing patterns, pathways, and play every day, but tomorrow's main focus is going to be pathways. And so this is a story that I think breaks some patterns and gives us some options for moving forward in a new pathway. And we have our good buddy Dennis Dewey to thank for this. Years and years ago, I want to say 95 maybe, he compiled, he noticed there were a lot of similarities between Luke's version of Jesus' birth and Luke's version of Jesus' death and resurrection. And so he compiled, and many of you have seen this, but it's worth seeing again. and there are many of you who've never seen it. But I thought it would be a good way to help us transition, to think about breaking our patterns. Like why would we put Christmas and Easter together, right? Break those patterns, and then you'll be able to sleep on this tonight, and thinking about some possible pathways forward. So. Jason, you're earning your pay. Yeah. Jason, are you ready for it?
Yes. No, I am.
In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be enrolled. Now this was the first enrollment when Quirinius was governor of Syria.
And Pilate gathered together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people. And he said to them, "Look, you brought me this man as one who was perverting the people. But I've examined him in front of all of you, and I haven't found him to be guilty of any of the charges you brought against him. Therefore, I'll chastise him and release him."
So all went to be enrolled, each to their own cities. And Joseph went from Galilee, from the city of Nazareth, to Judea, to the city of David, which is Bethlehem. He went to be enrolled with Mary, who was his betrothed, and she was with child.
But their cries were urgent. They lifted their voices loudly, demanding that he should be crucified. And their voices prevailed. Pilate gave sentence that their demand was to be granted. And he released for them Barabbas, a man who had been thrown into jail for insurrection and murder. This is the one they requested. But Jesus, he delivered up to their will.
And while they were there, the time came for her to be delivered.
And once they had reached the place called the Skull, there they crucified him, along with two common criminals, one on his right and one on his left. And Jesus said, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing."
So she brought forth her firstborn son. She wrapped him in swaddling clothes.
And they cast lots to divide his garments
And laid him in a manger. For there was no room for them at the inn. Now in that region, there were shepherds out in the fields, watching over their flocks by night.
And all the people stood by, watching.
And an angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone all around them. They were filled with fear. And the angel said, "Do not be afraid, for behold, I bring you good news of great joy, which will be for all the people. For born to you this day in the city of David is the Savior, who is Christ the Lord."
But the rulers scoffed, saying, "He saved others. If this really is the Christ of God, God's chosen one, then let him save himself."
And this will be a sign to you.
when the sun's light failed, the curtain in the temple was torn in two, and Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Father, into thy hands I commit my spirit."
You will find the babe wrapped in swaddling cloths.
And Joseph of Arimathea took down the body of Jesus and wrapped it in a linen shroud,
And lying in a manger.
and laid him in a rock-hewn tomb. And suddenly there was with the angel a whole multitude of the heavenly hosts, praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest heaven, and on earth peace among those with whom God is well pleased."
And the women who came with Jesus from Galilee followed. And they saw the tomb and how the body was laid in it. And then they returned to prepare spices and ointments.
Well, once the angels had returned to heaven, the shepherds said to one another, let's go to Bethlehem and see this thing that the Lord has made known to us.
On the first day of the week, at early dawn, they came.
And they went with haste. And they found Mary and Joseph and the babe lying in a manger.
They saw the tomb, but the stone had been rolled away. And when they went in, they did not see a body.
But when the shepherds saw the babe lying there in the manger, they made known the saying that had been told to them concerning this child.
While they were perplexed, suddenly 2 men stood before them in dazzling apparel. And they said, Why do you look for the living among the dead? Do you not remember what he told you when you were in Galilee? That the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinners, crucified, and then on the 3rd day rise?
But all who heard this wondered. But Mary kept all these things, pondering them in her heart.
And they did remember his words. And they returned. And they told the 11 and everyone else.
And then the shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all that they had heard and seen, just as it had been told them.
But they thought this was an idle tale. They did not believe them.
Thank you, Tracy, for a powerful way to kick off our time together. Dinner is next, so that's good news. You can make your way back over through the breezeway over to the dining room, and then the choir rehearsal following that, and workshops tonight. So enjoy the rest of the evening together.
good. Yep.